Kansas voters rejecting a constitutional amendment to change the Supreme Court's selection process with a resounding no.
Over 60% of voters rejecting that amendment that would require an election for judges. Gail Chapman joins us after talking with the experts on the issue to tell us what this means now for Kansas moving forward. Gail?
Well, Mike, Rachel, in short, this means everything will stay the same and the 70-year-old system for appointing judges will stay in place.
How about that no vote, huh?
Here's how it'll all continue to work.
68%.
The state Supreme Court nominating commission will review applications and interview nominees. That committee then passes on 3 candidates to the governor, who decides on which candidate to appoint to the court. Justices are subject to retention elections after their first year and after each 6-year term.
What we did last night was defend our Supreme Court, its impartiality, its merit-based selection, and the idea that Kansans are the ones who voted to build this system in the first place.
This isn't the first Republican-backed constitutional amendment Kansas voters have turned down. In 2022, voters rejected an amendment that would have taken away the right to abortion on similar margins. So one big question remains, why does Kansas vote so reliably conservative on everything but these constitutional amendments? We asked Wichita State University political science professor Dr. Neil Allen after the vote was called Tuesday.
Voters tend not to like to change the Constitution, especially whenever the language is very complicated, difficult to understand. And it frankly is surprising in an electorate that is going to have a lot more Republicans in it, and when conservative Republicans have done very well, that a lot of those voters still are not willing to change.
But Logan Stinsing with Kansas Appleseed sees it differently.
Kansans are not very political people. We are an incredibly common sense bunch of folks who believe strongly about principles that transcend partisanship.
Stinsing and Kansas Appleseed say the next step for Kansans is to continue to stay involved at the local and state level, especially as we get closer to the general election in November. Mike?
Thanks.